So the reason that I chose this chapter was because last year I've been working through this book with some students in one-to-ones as I've been supporting the Christian unions in Brighton and Sussex universities. And I found it to be a really good book. It's a great book on leadership, helping them to realise the priority of prayer, looking at Nehemiah's example, to see how Nehemiah depends on God for the ministry that he's involved in, and also the model of godliness that Nehemiah is to us. But it's also a great book on principles for doing God's work, and in this side of the cross, thinking about it as building God's kingdom. It helps us to face opposition in a godly way, helps us to seek justice as Nehemiah did, and also to know how we can deal with personal criticism. But it also, I really love this book because it feels like you're reading his personal journal entries. You get an insight into how Nehemiah felt about situations, and you get an insight into his own thought life and his own personal prayers, just between him and God, which we don't often get throughout other books of the Bible that are just narration telling us stories and what's been going on throughout the Bible. And chapter 2 is great. It's got so much in it, so much that we can take from it. My approach today will be to help us to learn something from Nehemiah and something about God as we just work through the passage and break it down to different sections and slowly work through it. And it's got a special relevance, just lastly, on the context for us, because we're not going into Grace Plant Brighton, we're not looking to rebuild something that's broken down, but we are looking to build something afresh in this new project, as Nehemiah was doing in Jerusalem. And so that's something that we should think about as we work through this passage. If we could just get the first slide up. So the bit of context for you, the book of Nehemiah was originally part of Ezra and Nehemiah, one book in the Hebrew Bible. And this is the context of it's not funny for me to have to look back, but this is the whole story of the Bible. I don't know if you can see that on Zoom. And just after Solomon's reign, Israel is split in two, and you have the southern kingdom and the northern kingdom. And the northern kingdom, who Elijah and Amos and Hosea speak into and call them to repentance and follow God, they eventually get exiled by the nation of Assyria. If you could have the next click, please. Yeah, Assyria, they come in and they exile the nation of the northern kingdom, Israel, and they end up becoming the lost 10 tribes of Israel. Next slide. And then the Babylon, this other foreign nation, come in and take over Assyria. And God continues to speak to the southern kingdom, Judah, through Isaiah, Micah, Jeremiah, but they also refuse to repent and continue to live their own way, following the ways of the nations. And then, led by Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian Empire comes in and destroys Jerusalem and takes away the southern kingdom, Judah, as well. And they're deported over to this foreign nation, Babylon. Next slide, please. Okay, so Persia then is another empire that takes over Babylon. And then Israel, basically Judah, is now called Israel at this point. They are now under this nation, Persia, which was Babylon before. Now they're living in Persia. And this king that we saw here, King Artaxerxes, he's the king of Persia. And so that's the kind of time that you need to think about that we're in. And we have people like Ezekiel and Daniel speaking to Israel as they're in captivity under the Persian Empire. But the exiles end up returning to the land under Ezra, which is the book that comes just before this. And then also, as we see in this passage, they continue to return, not only building the temple, which we learn about through Ezra, but also the walls of Jerusalem under Nehemiah, throughout the book of Nehemiah. And then, some of those things are happening through Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi, and Ezra and Nehemiah. So that's a bit of a satellite view, really, of where we've got the kind of biblical overview of where we are. Okay, next slide. Here's just a bit of historic history for you as well. So we've got this Persian king Cyrus in Ezra 1 who says, "Go and build," and he even refers to God in saying to the Israelites, "You can now go back and you can build the temple that they want to build." And then we've got various kings in between that time. The temple's eventually finished in Ezra 6, And then Artaxerxes, he even blesses the temple in Ezra 7. But some of Israel's enemies come up to Artaxerxes and they say, "Oh, you don't want them to continue to build Jerusalem. They're going to be trouble for you. You want them to stop this building." And so Artaxerxes says, "Okay, you must stop this building until I say otherwise. This building work has to stop in Jerusalem." And then in 445 BC, in this passage that we're looking at today, Artaxerxes then says, basically, effectively, continue. Okay, the work can continue on again. So that's a bit of a bird's eye view for you. Now, zooming in on chapter 1, which is not the passage we're focusing on, but it just gives a little bit of background. Basically, Nehemiah has heard news from his brothers who have come from Jerusalem, and they're telling him that Jerusalem is in a bad state. Verse 3 of chapter 1. "The remnant there in the province who had survived the exile is in great trouble and shame. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down and its gates are destroyed by fire." And that to Nehemiah is just terrible news. I think he hoped that the work would have progressed more. He hoped that it wouldn't have been such a dire state. And so he actually, in response to that, weeps and mourns and fasts and prays. And he wants circumstances to change. And we learn by the end of chapter 1 that basically what his prayer is to have an opportunity to go before the king and to make a request to say, basically, "Hey, King Artaxerxes, can I go and help to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem because it's in a terrible state?" And we learn at the end of chapter 1, he says, "No, I was cupbearer to the king," which basically would have meant that he would have been the person to drink the wine before the king drank the wine. He would test it first because it was a common way of having like a coup to take down the leadership in that time was to poison the drink that they would drink. So the way to try and avoid that was to have someone like Nehemiah who would be a cupbearer, who would be like, "You have it first. You're like a guinea pig, basically. If you drink it and you die, then I'm not going to drink that wine. But if you drink it and you're okay, then I'll drink it." So he had a big responsibility. But it wasn't just this, "Oh, you drink the wine and that's all." No, Nehemiah would have had a lot of responsibility as cupbearer to the king. And he would have had the ear of the king. And he's praying for an opportunity to ask the king to go to Jerusalem. Now we're going to zoom in on this first section, verse 1 to 8. Nehemiah making this request. Chapter 1, verse 1 says that he heard in the month of Chislev, which is some olden way of referring to these months, in the 20th year of Artaxerxes. He heard in the month of Chislev the news about Jerusalem, but in chapter 2, verse 1, he heard in the month of Nisan. It's got nothing to do with car manufacturing. It's just to do with the month that they used. And basically 4 months have passed, so he's been praying for 4 months for this opportunity to be able to talk to the king. And he's sad in the presence of the king, and the king notices it. And you may have noticed when the king says, "Why was your face sad, seeing you're not sick?" Nehemiah immediately is struck with fear and terror. He's so scared that the king has noticed that he's sad. And the reason for that is partly because it would be inappropriate to be sad in the presence of the king. It would be kind of like, inappropriate to show those emotions. But also, I think the reason he's afraid, is because, this is the moment. Maybe this is the opportunity for him to make this request. And 4 months of building up to this moment, it's what's going to happen. It's scary stuff. How's he going to respond? And also, remember, Artaxerxes is the most powerful person in the known world at the time, so he doesn't want to get on the wrong side of Artaxerxes. Anyway, so he does explain his sadness. He says, "Why should my face not be sad when the city, the place of my father's graves, lies in ruins, and its gates have been destroyed by fire?" What's interesting about that explanation is that it's not a political. He doesn't make some political point. It's very personal. He's referring to the city of his ancestors, city of his father's graves, and so it's a way of connecting with the king as well, saying, "Look, this is a personal thing to me. This is why I'm sad," and he does see this as an opportunity to make his request. Before he even makes his request, though, the king notices that something is on his mind, and he says, "Look, what are you requesting?" in verse 4. And before he makes his request, he prays. He just Maybe he says something like, God, please help me to say this in the right way, or please soften the king's heart. Help me to in this situation. He says in verse 4, I pray to the God of heaven. And then he basically summarizes what he wants from the king. He wants to go to rebuild. He wants to rebuild the city. And the king is not opposed to this, but the king obviously will need to know some details. How much annual leave is he going to have to book off for Nehemiah in order to go and do this work? And then Nehemiah makes his specific request. He's quite bold, isn't he, in asking that he can have timber for these different things that he's going to be building, for the gates of the fortress of the temple, for the wall of the city, and for the house that he'll live in. And he also is asking for safe passage. He's asking for a visa in order to get through this area that he's going through. So he makes his request. The opportunity has come, and he's made his request. It's actually interesting, isn't it, that Jerusalem at no point is mentioned. Remember, Artaxerxes had been the king who said that the work in Jerusalem must stop until I say so. And I wonder if Nehemiah was being a little bit clever here, not mentioning Jerusalem. Although he does obviously at the end talk about the temple, which would have implied Jerusalem. But that's not till the end. And the king grants his request. The king says, yes, you can go. That's what we see at the end of this passage in verse 8, end of this section. Next slide. Next slide. First application point for us to take out from this section here is to be faithful in prayer. As I've noted, Nehemiah's been praying for 4 months for this opportunity to come before the king. This thing that the Lord had laid upon his heart to request and to rebuild Jerusalem. And we need to take note of that and think, what are the things that we need to continue to pray for as God's people, as the things that he's laid on our hearts and the things that we know that are on his hearts. Some things we'll need to keep praying for. Maybe some things we've stopped praying for, but we need to return to praying. I think of the lost in Moulsecoombe and East Brighton that we exist to share the gospel with. How much are we praying for them? We need to keep praying for them to be saved. Even if we might not see the results, see the things that we want to see happen just yet, let's keep praying, because that's why we're here. That's part of our vision. That's what we're doing. And that's what God has laid upon our hearts as a church. Let's continue to pray for opportunities to speak to these people. And let's continue to pray for our own sanctification as we grow in godliness. As we might feel frustrated at times, I know I have, about how slow we grow in holiness and godliness. And we think, oh, God, can't you just speed the process up? I feel like I'm taking me so long to get over these sins, or change my desires to not be wrapped up in the world, but with you. And that's something we need to continue to keep praying for and persevere in it, as Nehemiah did in praying for that opportunity to come before the king. So don't give up praying. Trust God's timing. And do send up those arrow prayers, as Nehemiah does here in verse 4. And, it's mid-conversation. I think it wouldn't have been out loud. It would have been in his head. He just before he makes that request to the king, he just says, oh, Lord, please help me, which is a really quick prayer. And we can take something from that. How can we be just quicker to pray on the spot in our heads for the Lord's help? Maybe in evangelism, when you're talking to somebody in a conversation, or you're with somebody else who's talking to somebody. How can you be praying for that conversation in that moment? Or as you come to church, how can you pray, Lord, change my heart posture to be a posture of service and seeking to encourage, because I know my heart wants to come and consume, but help me to be wanting to serve. Or maybe if you're having an argument with your spouse, with your parent, with your child, with your school teacher, how can you say, Lord, help me in this situation. I can't do it without you. And Ephesians 6:18 says, pray at all time in the Spirit, with all prayer and supplication. So let's be faithful in prayer like Nehemiah. Secondly, second slide, or the next slide, is respect authority. I love how Nehemiah respects authority here. We see it starts in verse 3, let the king live forever. And then he says in verse 5, if it pleases the king. And he says in verse 7, if it pleases the king. He really respects and honors this king. But it's not because Artaxerxes was a nice guy. He probably wasn't a nice guy at all. He was probably a pretty nasty guy and did some horrible things. But that's not why he respected him, because he was scared of him. But it probably wasn't because because he was not, he was a nice guy, as I say, because he's not a nice guy. But it probably wasn't because he was powerful and could hurt him. No, it's because of his position. Nehemiah recognizes his position of authority and submits to that, as we're encouraged to do as well. When Peter writes to the exiles, the people, the Christians scattered throughout the empire in Rome, the Roman Empire, he says this: "Be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be to the emperor as supreme, or as to governors as sent by him, to punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good. Honor everyone, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the emperor." And as Julian always reminds us, the emperor at this time that Peter was talking about was Emperor Nero, who was a really not a nice guy at all. He was persecuting the Christians in horrible ways. And yet here Peter is saying, look, honor the emperor, be subject to these human institutions, because actually they're there for your good. We learn in Romans 13, Paul says actually that the authority that there is in the world has been established by God. Now, of course, the authorities abuse their power at times, and sometimes really badly, and a lot of the time. But we still need to honor and respect them wherever possible. Just think of the way that Jesus interacted with authorities throughout the Gospels, or the way that Paul interacted with the authorities as well. I think of a time when he kind of said something in rebuke to the high priest, and someone said, "Oh, you can't speak like that to him. He's the high priest." And Paul said, "Oh, sorry, I didn't realize he was the high priest. I wouldn't have said that if I'd known he was the high priest." So yeah, how can we too respect authority and honor those that God has put in authority over us in the workplace, or in our schools, or in society, or in the church? Obviously, we need to fear God first and foremost before fearing human authority. But as we fear human authority, knowing that God has put it in place for our good, we will have a greater chance of success, won't we, in influencing society and changing the culture at large. It does adorn our gospel message and the way that we seek to change things when we write to our MP in a way that is courteous and considerate and respectful. And as we talk about authority amongst one another, together and with non-Christian friends, family, as if we are kind of slandering and bringing down the authority, it does less of a good witness. So we've had being faithful in prayer, respecting authority. And final thing for this section that we're looking at, verse 1 to 8, is acknowledge God as the mover. Acknowledge God as the ultimate mover. In verse 8, Nehemiah says, "And the king granted what I asked, for the good hand of my God was upon me." So that's the reason he gives. And when we look at this passage, nothing particularly miraculous, supernatural has happened, has it? It's all, in some ways, humanly speaking, it's all really quite ordinary. It's just a conversation between a king and one of his high officials, servants, and the king grants the request of the servant. But we see that this request is foreshadowed by lots of prayer, isn't it? 4 months worth of praying. Even this arrow prayer in verse 4, and then it's bracketed by an acknowledgement of God, both in that prayer and at the end. Nehemiah sees the unseen. He sees that God here is answering a prayer. He acknowledged that it is God who is at work here in answering this prayer. He's the one that's ultimately behind it. Even though it's the human King Artaxerxes, that's saying, yes, you can go to Jerusalem. He says in verse 8 that it's actually because it's because of God's favor. It's because ultimately it pleases the king that he's gone to Jerusalem, that he's had this request granted. And we read in Proverbs 21, verse 1, "The king's heart is a stream of water in the hand of the Lord. He turns it wherever he will." Which is mysterious, isn't it? How we can hold these two things in tension, that God is ultimately sovereign at our work, fulfilling and carrying out his purposes, and yet at the same time, as human beings, we are morally accountable for our actions, for our decisions. But that is the clear teaching of the Bible all throughout, and it's unashamed to teach that. And so we need to remember as well that ultimately it is the Lord who is sovereign, and that can be a great comfort to us. It means that we should bring everything to him. It means that we should depend on him to be the one to move. And it means that nothing is too difficult for him. There's one final thing to mention on this, actually, is that God is personal. I think is one more thing. No, go back, please. Isn't the bonus point? God is personal. He says in verse 4 and verse 20, the God of heaven. So in one sense, we do need to remember that God is the God of heaven. He's the awesome creator of the entire universe. And yet also in verse 8, in verse 12, in verse 18, Nehemiah says, my God. He's both the God of heaven and he's my God. He's a personal God. And we see other characters in the Bible, don't we, like David, experiencing and enjoying this intimacy with the Lord. God is personal, but he's also awesome, and we need to keep those both in mind. Remember both of them. Remembering that God is the God of heaven, keeps us humble, helps us to recognize our sin before him, and yet remembering that he's my God, he's our personal God, reminds us of his love and motivates joyful service. Okay, so we're going to go to the next section now, which is very short, 9 to 10. All seems to be going well. Nehemiah's got this request granted. He's even got all this wood with him. He's even got this parade of officers of the army. In verse 9 says that have gone with him to protect him, which I don't think was even mentioned a bit before. So he's got this extra bonus help to go with him. The Lord seems to be in it, as Nehemiah had suspected, that this was the hand of God in all of it. And yet he faces opposition. Opposition rears its ugly head. Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite servant hear it, and they are greatly displeased. The opposition doesn't really find proper expression until the end of this chapter, and then into chapter 4 as well. But this should remind us that this is common pattern in following God. That when we're walking with the Lord, when we're seeking to make progress in faith, that opposition will present itself. And so when we're making that progress in faith, as we seek to overcome sin in our life, as we seek to overcome recurring patterns of going away from God, as we make bold steps in that, we may face spiritual attack, persecution, temptations from the devil. He hates the fact that we want to make progress and overcome and grow in godliness to be distinctive from the world. As those of us who preach often experience, although the preaching has a great potential for good to shape the hearts and minds of the church, preaching can often be a real spiritual battle, and it's like these doubts that the devil sows in your heart. It's like, oh, you're not really good enough, or this message isn't really that good, is it? Or that kind of thing. And the devil seeks to undermine. So as we take that step, seeking to preach, there's a kind of a burden that the devil lays on you. And as we go out to do bold, faith-filled mission, as we seek to plant Brighton, we should expect some opposition, some spiritual attack. And with the advance of God's purposes comes opposition. This pattern is the normal pattern throughout the Bible. And we see that here in verse 9 to 10. And when that happens, we need to not be surprised. We need to be ready for it. Remember when Jesus said in the garden to his disciples, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. And that was why they needed to pray. They needed to continue to pray and lean on God, because we cannot do it alone. Third section, 11 to 20. What's the next slide? Next slide. Yes, 11 to 6, in the verses 11 to 16, Nehemiah goes around and he's inspecting the walls. He's trying to figure out what exactly they're up against here. 3 times he mentions that he does this at night, and twice he mentions the fact that this is unknown to anyone else. And so it seems that Nehemiah, writing this journal entry, is actually trying to make a point. I'm doing this in secret. I didn't want anyone to know about this thing. He's preparing himself for this speech that he's going to be making in the last section, 17 onwards. He's preparing himself for the speech, and he knows his stuff. He's familiar with the landscape of what they're up against. And in verses 17 to 18, he rallies the people. He reminds them, or he tells them, that God is on their hand. God is on their side. Verse 18, the hand of my God that had been upon me for good. I told them of the hand of my God that have been upon me for good. So, yeah, God is on their side. God is with them. And yet also they have this human authority backing them up, which is a bonus, isn't it? I told them of the words of the king that have been spoken to me. And I think we can learn from Nehemiah here to like him, be prepared for the battles that we are to face, to understand the task at hand. That may mean trying to understand, familiarize ourselves with the idols of the culture that we are in, the points of friction between the gospel message and the culture that we live in. We need to listen and understand. Just think of Paul in Athens. He starts his speech by saying, "Men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you're very religious." So he knows they're very religious. He's gone round. He understands the city that they live in. He understands the gods that they worship. And he goes on to say, "As even some of your own poets have said, for we are indeed his offspring." So it's clear that Paul has read the poetry of Athens. And so we too, how can we be familiar with the strongholds that keep people away from Christ, the thinking that is unhelpful and ungodly in our culture, amongst our non-Christian family, friends, people that we work with? How can we just be better listeners through asking questions in conversation, be reading books that people are reading, be plugged into what's going on in the world? How can we be reflecting on why people think the way that they do, rather than just having the conversation and moving on? How can we be thinking about it reflectively? John Stott called this double listening. He says, "Double listening is the faculty of listening to two voices at the same time, the voice of God through Scripture and the voices of men and women around us. These voices will often contradict one another, but our purpose in listening to them both is to discover how they relate to one another. Double listening is indispensable to Christian discipleship and Christian mission." So that will help us to share the gospel more relevantly if we understand the battles that we're up against, the task at hand. And as we seek to understand the needs in our context, it will also help us to address the injustices that surround us, and so be able to build God's kingdom more accurately. Nehemiah knew his stuff. He's researched the challenges ahead in building Jerusalem. And we too should know our stuff as best we can, to understand the challenges as best as possible as we seek to build his kingdom here on earth. And yeah, I think I'll finish on that point there. So just in the last part of the passage, 19 to 20, we once again see this opposition. And this time with an extra person that's joined the opposition, Geshem, the Arab. But how does Nehemiah respond? He says, "The God of heaven will make us prosper, and we his servants will arise and build. But you have no portion or right or claim in Jerusalem." Nehemiah is sure of his calling. He's sure of now that God is with him, that he's behind them in what they're doing. And so he's confident in God's backing and confident in responding to the opposition, knowing the truth. And so let's just summarize what we've been looking at so far. So we've got be faithful in prayer. Let's take example from Nehemiah and how he prays, persevering in what God's laid on our hearts, sending up those arrow prayers throughout the day. Respect authority. Acknowledge God as the ultimate mover behind things, and so bring things to him, depend upon him. Expect opposition as you act in faith. And know your battles as you seek his kingdom. Let's pray.